Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about how people are changing and how that could change the whole future of our society. Our guest is Marie Spengler, who headed the Values and Lifestyles program at SRI International's Future Group for 4 years. Marie has worked as a systems engineer for IBM, as a senior consultant in France, and after 7 years at SRI, recently left to become president of AID, a microprocessor company. She is probably the only certified massage therapist in California who is an MBA graduate of Harvard University. How are values and lifestyles in America changing?
Well, I think the most significant trend is probably the move from what we call outer directedness to what we call inner directedness. And what that means is people traditionally, the traditional American values of belonging to a group, being accepted by the group, achieving and having other people see your success are all outer directed values, people really looking to what other people think about them. And I'd say the large majority of Americans traditionally have held these values. They probably came across in the Mayflower. Since about the mid-60s, we've seen a real growth in what we call inner-directed values, which is people having their own internal sense of what's fitting, fulfilling, balancing for them, and caring more about that. That's as their primary motivation in life. And that group now represents about 21% of the adult population.
How do you measure something like that? How do you get a statistical figure on an inner-directed person?
Yeah, well, we do extensive surveys. When I say we, I'm referring to the Values and Lifestyles program, which I just recently left. We do extensive national surveys every year of large representative samples. We ask hundreds of questions with the standard, age, sex, income. Also, a lot of attitudinal questions, things like, do you believe the world was literally created in 6 days? And do you think marijuana should be legalized? We ask a number of questions, and we have a weighting system. We run them through a computer, and this is based on a theoretical model that was created by Arnold Mitchell, my colleague there, with the theory of how these people fall into different groups. And then based on their answers to the questions, we see, we assign them to one of the groups. And then we look at literally thousands of different questions that we and other people that we have joint ventures with ask of a wide population that has been grouped this way to see if the answers that they give, the products they buy, the attitudes they have, the sports that they engage in, the media they read and watch, if these things really suggest that the theory is correct.
And from everything that you've gotten out of it so far, you feel real comfortable with those numbers?
Yes, we feel very comfortable with them. We've started doing our research about 6 years ago now, and we've done several national surveys ourselves over the years, and we are linked up with groups that survey, for example, 20,000 people every year. That's a very, very large sample of people. And it would just be too big a coincidence that when we take all these people and group them into these types, the answers to these hundreds and hundreds of questions seem to match the pattern. Like, for instance, we say belongers, which is the largest group in our population, about 35% of the population, are people who want to fit in and not stand out. They're people who are family-oriented, traditional, they respect authority. They're not the innovators. They're not people who rush in to buy a new product because they want to wait and be sure that somebody else they know is doing it so that it's safe to do. And when you look at the products they buy, the attitudes they have, the media they read and listen to, etc., you see that really does fit the description of the people who come out as belongers in our typology.
What are the numbers again, and can you put that in some historical frame of reference?
Yes. Right now, the outer directed group represents about 67% of our population, about two-thirds of, I'm talking about adults, 18 years and over. There's a third group that's called need-driven, who are people who are money-restricted. They represent about 11% of the population. Then about 67% or two-thirds are outer-directed, and about 21% are inner-directed. And the inner-directeds really started coming on the scene in large numbers around the mid-'60s when we had the so-called New Values, the radical movement on the campuses. This was what gave it enough of a critical mass to become kind of an alternative value system that people could choose to sort of developed through, as opposed to the traditional.
How big was the group in terms of percentages in 1968?
Well, we don't really have any measures of that because Arnold only really came up with the concept in 1977. So we can surmise that they weren't very big just looking at what American culture was like. I mean, looking back at the 1950s, for example, it was obvious that inner-directedness was not a major thrust. Now, there have always been individual inner-directed people in our culture. We suppose that, for instance, Emerson and Jefferson and Thoreau were probably what we call inner-directed. But until 1978, we really didn't have any measurements on these people. But I think it's safe to say they were no more than 2-3% of the population.
Would you say that you are an example of someone who epitomizes the new values, the new inner-directedness?
Well, in a way, just because I think one of the overarching messages from our research is that people are having more and more diverse values. And people often comment about my background that it's very diverse, that I, having an MBA from Harvard and having been a systems engineer, which seem like very left-brain, rational, scientific kinds of things, and then being into holistic health and massage therapy and mysticism and that type of thing, which is very right-brain. So in that sense, I'd say I probably am. I'm someone who started out with typical middle-class belonger kind of environment. I say my parents are good belongers, like probably most of our parents are. And I went through the emulator stage and the achievement stage, and then became increasingly inner-directed. And I think what happens to people, at least our theory says this, and I've seen this in my own life, is as you achieve the trappings of the outer-directed lifestyle, in other words, the goals and the motivations that society gave to you, that somebody out there said, this is what you should like and this is what you should do, as you achieve those things and get the satisfaction of them, you start realizing that, well, is this all there is? There's more. There's an aspect of life that goes beyond the material. And being outer-directed is also, it turns out, it's very materialistic perspective. It's, materialism, gain, wanting to be rich and successful, caring what other people out there think about one. It's all very materialistic type thing. So I think you reach a point where you're sort of saturated at that level, and you start exploring inside for something more. And so in that sense, I'm probably typical. I was in college in the 60s, and that's the age group. I'm of that generation.
Is there, before we get into some of the specifics, is there an overriding motivation for people who were outer-directed, who have since become inner-directed? What were they looking for? Happiness?
Oh boy, that's a very general question. I'm not really
I'm a generalist.
I'm not really qualified to answer that. I don't think anybody is. I think it's a very individual thing. I think there are certain universal values, things that we talk about this in our reports to our corporate sponsors of the VOWS program, things like love, affection, friendship, solitude, escape, aesthetics. There's a certain sense of peace and well-being that are really the bottom line that I think everybody's looking for at some level. And then it gets complicated in the sense of, well, how do people interpret they're going to find this? What do they think will bring them these things?
You've mentioned a couple of things, survivors, belongers. You've kind of categorized some of the different types of people in the society. Can we run through some of them and
Sure.
and maybe give an example or a definition of what you mean when you say the heading for the category?
Sure, I'll go through it very quickly. We have two need-driven groups, survivors and sustainers. The survivors represent about 4% of the population. They're the oldest group, about 60% women because they're older, a lot of widows, a lot of retired people on fixed incomes. They're people who are severely entrenched in a culture of poverty, either through old age and a fixed income or through just being born into an impoverished environment and not having a way of getting out. The sustainers, there are about 7% of the population, and they are a very different group. They're younger. They have an average age of around 30. They tend to be found in the big cities. They're people who are angry. They're struggling in and out of poverty. They don't have the resignation that the survivors have. They're people who are younger and who are looking ahead and want to get somewhere and want to get out of that culture of poverty. So they're people who are in and out of poverty. They often are mistrustful of the system. They tend to just be meeting their basic wants, but they'll often have a splurge item, the Cadillac in the ghetto type syndrome, or other. There's a lot of splurge buying amongst the sustainers. Then we move into the outer directed groups. There are three groups. There are the belongers, which are 35%, the largest group in the population. They are, as I said, family-oriented, tradition-oriented. They tend to be formal. They tend to be suspicious of those outside the group. All of these groups have really negative and positive attributes. The positive attributes of the belongers are that they give some stability to our society. They're like the tree with the deep tap root. When there's so much else changing, these are the people who really want to preserve the status quo and who know what works. They're frugal consumers. They plan their lives carefully. They tend to be middle to lower income, education, and social status. They tend to live in the country and small towns more than other groups. So they're less stimulated. Now, the negative side of belongers is that they're a little bit suspicious of those outside the group, so they tend to be fiercely patriotic and that type of thing. Now, after the belongers, we have what we call emulators. That's a smaller group. It's about 9% of the population. Again, younger, median age of around 30. And these are people who are emulating those they think are richer or more successful than themselves. They're people who put their money where it shows and fancy clothes, cars, that type of thing. There are people who are either just sort of frustrated and trying to be something they aren't, or they're people who are sort of on their way up the path to becoming what we call the next group, which are the achievers. The achievers are about 22% of the adult population, making them the second biggest group after belongers. And the achievers are the active, dynamic, successful leading edge of the traditional American values represented by the belongers. The achievers are more open to change than the belongers. They really like the new and improved product, especially if it smacks of high technology. They're people who want the latest. They've got very high incomes. They're the leaders of business and industry. And they're more open to change than the belongers, but they don't want too much change because they're the people on top. They're the people who really are on top of this system. And they tend to be quite traditional. By their own admission, they say they're conventional. And if you look at their purchase data, they tend to be pretty traditional buyers too. But affluent buyers, so they buy a lot of top-of-the-line things and support a lot of the high-margin markets. So those are the traditional groups. Now, if we go over to the inner-directed group, which now represents, as I said, about 21% of the population, we have three subgroups there. The first is a small group called I Am Me. They represent about 3% of the population, and that's mostly an adolescent group, 18 to 25, highly transitory. It's a group that many people pass through, but they don't tend to live and die, live out their lives as I Am Me's. It's a breaking away from the old outer directed values. It's a saying, I'm who I am. They're fiercely individualistic. They mature into what we call the experiential group, which represents about 7% of the population. These are people who are into direct experience. They don't want the second hand. They want to see it, touch it, feel it, do it themselves. They like deep personal relationships, intense involvement. For instance, in sports, they hardly ever watch television, the experientials, and they're definitely not interested in watching a sporting event, either on television or even in person. They want to do it themselves. They're into things like skiing and hang gliding and backpacking. They want that intense experience. In a job situation, the experientials, for example, are not contented to shuffle papers for 25 years because 25 years from now they'll get a gold watch and become a vice president. This is the now generation. They want their work to be satisfying every day. There are people who often are earning less than their earning potential because their priorities are not money. So they will either take a part-time job or take a job that gives them less income than they could earn because they want the freedom or they want to do something that's interesting to themselves. The final inner-directed group we call the societally conscious, and they're currently at about 11% of the population. the experientials and the societally conscious are the two fastest growing groups in the population. They have been for the last 10 years, and we predict that they will continue to be for the next, till the end of this decade. The societally conscious are very much like the experiential. They're a little more mature. The societally conscious have a median age of 38, where the experientials it was 28. And they're imbued with a sense of societal responsibility. They want to live in a way that's right livelihood. They want to take care, protect, conserve. They have an ecological ethic. They have a one world, a global perspective. They're people who have realized that in answering their own inner sense of what's right for them, there comes a point when you really have to consider that if you really want to do that, you have to let everybody else do that too. And there has to be this concern for having it work for everybody. So these are the people who have led most of the single-issue political movements during the 1970s in this country, the environmentalist movement, the consumer movement, etc. They're people who really want to make the world work better for everybody. We have a very small group at the top that we call integrated. They're currently about 2%. We don't spend a lot of time dealing with the integrated for our corporate clients because they're such a small, diverse group that they don't really make up a significant market. But socially, they're important as a model of where this whole thing goes. They're people who are integrated in the various domains of life. They're free to try or not try whatever they think is fitting. They embody both the sort of action-oriented, pragmatic, outer-directed attributes with the more intuitive and aesthetic, softer, receptive attributes of the inner directeds.
And you say that's the direction that we're heading, is more integration, crossing the boundaries. One of the things that I'm trying to follow the various types that you've identified, you talked about the belongers as being very family-oriented, and I'm thinking that in some of the individuals that I know from my own experience, that there are some experiential people and some achievers even that are also very family-oriented, at least in the rough definitions, that are, part of interdirectedness might be family.
Absolutely.
Directedness.
In fact, it's what happens. It's hard to talk about this without the visuals to go with it, because we have this nice little diagram that shows how they split and come back together, and it helps make sense out of it. But basically what we see happening is that there are many similarities between, let's say, the societally conscious and the belongers. In terms of lifestyles, they are family-oriented. The societally conscious, like the belongers, are very much into community, self-sufficiency, frugal consumption, that type of thing. I know some people that are very interdirected that live in Montana, for example, which is real old-fashioned belongersville in many ways. And they say they get along great with the local belongers. It snows and everybody helps their neighbors plow the driveway, and they have a lot of similarities in the lifestyle level. However, if you start talking philosophy or politics or cosmology, you may run into a little trouble. The societally conscious have this global perspective, the one-worldism, and the belongers are into, we don't want to buy them foreign products. And
let's keep the city people out of Montana.
Yeah, right. And when you talk about religion, the societally conscious tend to be into the Eastern religions, the universal type religions, the recognition that we're all one and part of God, whereas the belongers tend to be more in the fundamentalist vein. If you don't have my religion, you're wrong. So they have a lot in common, and yet you can see they're coming from a very different value set.
Where are we started out talking a little bit about the 60s and the people who started the whole thing rolling, many of them on college campuses and in the anti-war movement, which has since become the peace movement. But where are those people now, the Haight-Ashbury crowd that dropped out back then, the first drug experimenters on a wide scale, the anti-war movement? Have those people been assimilated in any one group, or are they all over?
Well, I think they're probably still largely in the inner-directed group, although some of them are definitely back in the achiever ranks. And there's some famous examples like Jerry Rubens, who was one of the radicals, that started the whole thing in Berkeley and then became a futures broker in New York. Now, I've heard since then he's no longer doing that. He's running some networking salons in New York for young professionals to make contacts. So he's become quite an enterprising entrepreneur. I'd say that a lot of these people have moved back into mainstream institutions. what I find, having dealt with, corporations for years, I mean, the last 4 or 5 years, I've been on the road maybe 2 or 3 months a year calling on hundreds of people every year in major corporations around the country. And corporations are filled with what I call the closet inner-directeds. I mean, you go into a meeting and you got a bunch of, people sitting there with suits and ties, and you don't really know by looking at them or by a demographic description. They're college graduates, they're 40 years old, they're earning $40,000 a year. You don't really know till you start talking to them that they may actually be very inner-directed. And I think what happened is a lot of these people rejected the mainstream institutions. They went out and they started, some of them went off to the country and were back to the land movement. So that got a lot of publicity. I don't think it ever really represented a lot of people. But it was significant because it was a symbol for a lot of other people who didn't do it. Some of them started alternative schools. Some of them started alternative businesses. Alternative just about anything. It was a rejection of what was in the 1960s, the institutional framework that existed then. And I think what's happened is that over the years, a number of factors have been bringing these people back into mainstream institutions. One is the economy turned bad. And so a lot of these alternative institutions just couldn't, the government loans dried up, and the affluence, the fringe affluence that may have supported them just wasn't there, and people were having to deal with their own basic needs and not being able to support idealistic things like this. And many of them were still in their infancy, so they couldn't make it through that. The other thing is a lot of the idealists realize that running away from the institutions doesn't make them go away, that the banks are still there, that large corporations are still there, that the airways are still filled with advertisements. And I think there's been a real recognition that if you really want to be societally conscious, you got to go back in and touch the mainstream, because it's not going to disappear. So a number of these factors, I think, have led a lot of those people, I think, have gone through an almost full cycle now. Rejecting being hippies, going into alternative everything, or tuning out completely. And now coming back, I meet people all over large American corporations who are very inner-directed and who either have been there all along and are sort of waking up to their inner-directedness, or people who left and went out and explored and then decided to come back. But I've seen a very great change in corporate America over the last 5 years towards being more tolerant of diversity. You read in the paper about companies used to expect their employees to take a transfer. The first few radical employees who said, we like it in this town, and my wife has a job, and my kids like the school here, and I don't care about having more money, well, you used to think these people would get fired or their career would be ruined. Well, that probably was true when there was only 1 or 2 people doing that. But now it has become so predominant that companies have realized that they don't have the power there anymore, and that they would be stupid to try to block the progress of somebody who feels that way, because the fact of the matter is somebody who feels that way may be amongst the most reflective, thoughtful, sort of leading-edge thinkers of the people in the company. And there are so many of them now that companies have changed because they've had to acknowledge and recognize that.
How much of it is just a function of age, of growing up into what was always there? That youth rejects. Children, as you watch them develop, oftentimes go through a stage of rejection. It's very natural, and then they come back into the fold after a while. That's what the skeptics would say from the outside of all of this.
Well, there's something to that, for sure. And we've just finished a big, massive body of research from our national survey that we got in last fall. And one of our conclusions, one of the main reports written by one of my colleagues, Jay Ogilvy, calls it the buckling down of the baby boom, which is basically saying that, because the baby boom exerted so much influence on our culture, that when they were students going through their Oedipal rebellion on the campuses, it influenced the whole country. And then they went through the 70s when they were into doing all just getting established and trying to make the world get set up right. And now they're, having kids and owning homes and all that. And there is sort of a buckling down, a reality thing that's come in. However, I would point out that the usual adolescent cycle is much shorter than that. I mean, these people have taken 20 years to go through that. So I wouldn't say it's entirely age-related. And you could cite, for instance, the delayed childbearing of women in this age group as one example. many women who are 40 now are having their first baby. With the next generation, it's probably the first time in history we've had two generations of women having their first babies at the same time. So I think there are a number of reasons, a number of things that suggest that it's not just an age-related thing. That something, when this generation went through the adolescent rebellion, they did not go back to what their parents were doing. Now, 20 years later, the skeptics may say they're going back, but I would also like to point out that that institutional world is nothing like it was 20 years ago. And the achievers who run it are nothing like they were 20 years ago. I've had people tell me that the 60s movement died out, that it, was gone and forgotten. And I point out to them that every major demand made by the student radicals in the 60s has been institutionalized in our culture today. That one reason it died out is because they got what they wanted.
Several previous guests on Infinity have suggested that it's much more than maturation process or a cyclical kind of thing, that somewhere in the not-too-distant past something happened, whether it was electrochemical or whatever the origins of it, that there was some spiritual seed that was planted on the earth and is spreading like wildfire. And you have much more of a statistical orientation than they do, but they just seem to sense it and feel it in their travels and the people that they're running into, the international movement.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, obviously, the statistics, if we go back, we can say that it's happening, but we really can't say why, because we haven't gotten to the genesis of it. How do you feel about that, the possibility of just the time being right for a major spiritual change?
Yeah. I'm happy now, right this minute, that I've now left the vows program, because I never really permitted myself to say this when I was representing a research-based program. It would impugn the objectivity of the program. The fact of the matter is, I personally believe that that's so. And it's something, here you leave the realm of rationality and you enter the realm of faith. And that's a difference between faith and rationality. You can't prove what you have faith in. If you did, it wouldn't be faith. It would be something different. I think that I came about, I sort of woke up to that realization in the sense that, being a very rational left-brain person and always wanting proof, I'm very skeptical about things. And looking at data, it's like you try out a hypothesis and you say, how do you make sense out of what's happening? And I found that you simply can't make sense out of what's happening today by applying the old perspective to it. And the perspective that we are, in fact, going through a major sort of spiritual transformation, an evolutionary flip, if you will, into a new stage of being, helps explain what we see in our data. It's a large enough context that you can make sense out of a lot of things that otherwise really don't make sense rationally. So I do feel that there is definitely that's going on.
Let's take it another half step. Where is it going?
Well, you really put me on the spot now, but I'll speak my truth. I really feel that we are parts of God, all of us, and always have been, whether we knew it or not, and always will be, whether we know it or not. And I believe we're waking up to that. And I believe that, people talk about the second coming of Christ. I believe that the second coming of Christ is coming, but we're it, all of us. That rather than somebody coming here, the spirit of that unconditional love, that peace and that abundance and that humanity, is that we are preparing as a species, that we finally have enough intelligence, enough consciousness, enough experience as a human species that we can embody that, all of us. And I think that's why the peace movement is picking up now, because part of that is peace and the recognition that we can't go on having war. And I think there is a wave of that going on, and that also explains the moral majority type things and the wars going on in the world today for me, because it's like when that sense of light and peace happens, and I see this in my own personal development and in a lot of other people's, when you really make a big leap forward, when you really expand and let that light through, there's a backlash, a shadow comes up and tries to scare you. It's like you have to, the Buddhists have an expression that I love, and it's, the closer you get to the temple, the bigger are the lions that guard the gate.